Welcome everyone to Heavenly Visions in Cork. William Burgess, Harry Clark and Seamus Murphy, and I hope you enjoy it. So in my talk I would like to look at some familiar works of religious art and architecture in Cork, and note that while they can be very spiritual in what they communicate and very beautiful to look at, there's often a lot more than religion and even beauty going on. Most works of both art and architecture are the result of a combination of different agendas, and this is what I want to explore here. I'll start with St. Finbarr's Cathedral, which you can see here and I'm sure you all know. This building was begun in 1865, the spires were finished in 1879, and the carving of the west front in 1883. After this, there were still some sections of the building that needed to be done, such as the vestry, completed in 1896, and the chapter house done in 1915. So what kind of concept did the architect William Burgess have when he designed and oversaw the construction of this church? What sort of result was he aiming for? Well, several things. He was very much an architect of the Gothic Revival. He loved the medieval period and claimed that he himself lived in the 13th century, mentally and emotionally, obviously, rather than physically. He wanted his cathedral to look like a medieval building, and he studied and was inspired by original medieval buildings, such as this one, Chartres Cathedral, near Paris in France. He wasn't alone in this, of course. Many architects embraced the Gothic style in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Possibly the most famous of these is the English architect Pugin, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, to give him his full name. When the old British Houses of Parliament burned down in 1834, Pugin worked with Charles Barry in designing the new ones. Pugin's contribution was the Gothic detailing and ornament on Barry's essentially symmetrical, classical building. People took notice of the Gothic style after this. They decided it must be a serious and prestigious style if it was used for the Houses of Parliament, so it became very popular for all sorts of buildings, but especially churches. This was partly because Pugin, who was also a writer, claimed that Gothic was much more appropriate for a Christian building than the classical style, which was, after all, inspired by pagan Greece and Rome. But also the Gothic style allowed a building to recall the time before the Reformation, when Christianity was the most powerful institution in Europe, and Gothic cathedrals were its most spectacular buildings. The Gothic Revival happened in Ireland too, where Pugin designed buildings such as this, St. Mary's Cathedral in Killarney. And Irish architects also got in on the act, so this is St. Patrick's in Armagh, designed by J.J. McCarthy, known as the Irish Pugin. And this is St. Coleman's Cathedral in Cove, designed by an English and an Irish architect, Pugin's son, Edward Welby Pugin, and the Cork man George Coppinger Ashland. It was begun in 1868 and consecrated in 1919. Now, it's not just the outside of St. Finbarr's that is Gothic. The style is carried right through into the interior and into all its details. The ceiling is very high, and there are 3 levels: the ground level, the triforium, which is a kind of balcony or gallery, and the clerestory, also called the clerestory, which was originally designed to allow light and air into a building. This lofty interior space is supposed to give you a sense of rising up to heaven, transcending earthly things. And you can see the same sort of arrangement here in Salisbury Cathedral in England on the left and Amiens in France on the right. And these are both, of course, original medieval cathedrals. The details on the outside of St. Finbarr's are also Gothic. You can see here its rose or wheel window on the right, and examples from Notre Dame de Paris and Chartres on the left, and you have Notre Dame on the top and Chartres on the bottom. And these, of course, all allow for the insertion of gorgeous stained glass. This is the St. Finbarr's rose window. The use of stained glass is, of course, also a Gothic characteristic, as is lots of sculpture. especially statuary, around the main western entrance. Burgess chose the New Testament parable of the wise and foolish virgins as the theme for his statuary around the main door. We can see here the wise virgins, the ones who stayed awake and kept their lamps trimmed while waiting for the bridegroom to arrive. And here, looking a lot less smug, the foolish virgins who fell asleep and allowed their lamps to go out. As a result, the wise virgins were allowed to enter the wedding feast along with the bridegroom as they were prepared, whereas the foolish ones had to remain outside. This parable is illustrated in various forms in the sculpture of many Gothic cathedrals. It's essentially about behaving yourself, and therefore always being ready to enter heaven when the time comes. Burgess also included medieval-style gargoyles and grotesques. Gargoyles are grotesque figures with spouts inserted to carry rainwater away from the building. No one really knows why horrible, demonic-looking creatures carved from stone were placed on the outside of medieval buildings. They may have symbolised the evils of the world outside the church, or they may have been protecting the holy space within from evil. Burgess also himself contributed in 1869 the gift of a gilt angel for the top of the roof at the east end, and you can see it here on the left. It represents the resurrection angel that blows a trumpet and wakes up the dead at the end of the world. There's also an angel over the east end of Chartres Cathedral, which you can see here on the right. The Gothic Revival, however, was not just about making buildings look medieval. According to Burgess and Pugin before him, it was also about continuing good design and craftsmanship into all aspects of a building. You didn't just design the shell, but every detail of what went into it, even the most seemingly trivial. And you only used the best materials, artists and craftsmen. This, of course, if carried out properly, could make a project very expensive, and St. Finbarr's turned out to be much more expensive than it was expected to be. It was supposed to cost no more than £15,000, but ended up costing well over 100,000, millions by today's standards. This is the building as it appeared around 1870, when they ran out of money. The project had to be stalled until donors could be found to fund not only decorations and furnishings, but also the towers and spires, basically the top of the church. They did find donors, although the bulk of the outstanding amount was put up mainly by two men, Francis Wise, a distiller, and William Crawford, a brewer. Burgess was a bit of a control freak. He wanted to make sure that even if he died while he was supervising the cathedral, that it would still be finished in every detail as he designed it. So between 1868 and 1869, he produced the Cork Book of Designs, which contained watercolour sketches drawn to scale for all 74 stained glass windows, as well as the price of each one. Horatio Lonsdale, an English painter and designer, then drew a set of full-colour cartoons for each window, and we see some examples of these here. Most of the windows were eventually filled with stained glass based on these drawings, and quite a few were done after Burgess's death. They were made by an English stained glass studio, Saunders and Company. The Book of Designs, which Burgess gave to the building committee, worked a bit like a catalogue. People could choose a gift or a memorial from it, knowing what it would look like, as well as what it would cost. In 1878, Burgess put together another book of sketches and instructions, this time for all the sculpture. Again, with every piece meticulously costed. Plaster models of the sculpture were made by the sculptor Thomas Nicholls in his London studio. The most demanding items, such as the life-size statues, were executed in stone by Nicholls himself in London, and later shipped over to Ireland to be put in place. The rest were done on the spot by other carvers. So, for instance, the carved head we see here, representing Ecclesia, or the Christian Church, was designed by Burgess, modelled in plaster in London by Nicholls, and sometime during 1878 or 1879 it was carved in place by the architectural carver Robert MacLeod. Most of the west front was carved between 1878 and 1883. By late 1876, Burgess had also completed another book, the Book of Furniture, as he called it, and this had colour drawings, instructions and prices for every detail of the church furniture and decoration. Burgess died in 1881, well before a lot of the building was finished, and long before they had got around to painting the apse ceiling, for instance. The apse ceiling is the ceiling over the altar space, which we can see here on the right, and its painting wasn't carried out until 1935, based on drawings from the 1876 Book of Furniture, some of which you can see here on the left. Interestingly, by 1935, the Gothic Revival style was very unfashionable, as was lots of painted ornament, and Burgess's style was particularly unfashionable. Less is more was becoming popular amongst designers, and Burgess's designs were very much more is more. Advice was sought at the time about what to do. Some experts suggested just going for a much plainer treatment and ignoring Burgess's designs. In the end, however, they did carry out his wishes, even though a lot of people at the time might have thought it was fairly gaudy. So long after he died, Burgess still had his way with the apse ceiling. Some of his designs, however, were never realised. The apse ceiling painting was never extended to the nave, the main body of the church, as Burgess had planned. The ambulatory, the walkway round the back of the altar, was never floored with medieval-style encaustic tiles, as he also wanted, and nobody came forward to pay for stained glass for 4 of the chancel windows. Also, despite his attention to detail, Burgess never bothered designing such practical elements as a vestry, a chapter house and an organ, all of which basically had to be tacked on later. He did provide for a small organ in the chancel, but the committee wanted a big, romantic, cathedral-scale one. They tried putting one in the west gallery, which didn't work, as the musicians in the choir couldn't hear it properly and the organist couldn't hear the singers. Eventually, in 1889, a 14-foot hole was dug in the floor of the north transept, beside the choir, and an organ was dropped into it. It's still there, and it looks a bit strange, to put it mildly. Medieval churches didn't have organs, you see, so Burgess wasn't particularly interested in including one. There were also other ways in which Burgess's vision differs from the finished product. The main entrance, as I said already, was designed to be flanked by 2 groups of statues representing the wise and foolish virgins, and this happened. But in the centre was supposed to be a full-size statue of Christ as the divine bridegroom, bearded, with a halo, wearing a crown and carrying an orb and sceptre. This would fit in with the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, and it would also echo statues such as this one on medieval churches. This is a portal or doorway figure of Christ on Chartres Cathedral. So the figure would work both as Christ and as the bridegroom of the parable, the divine bridegroom. However, some members of the building committee were not at all impressed with this proposal. The idea of an image of Christ on the main entrance to an Anglican cathedral was a step too far for them. No doubt there were already concerns that the church was looking a bit too elaborate, full of stained glass and borderline idolatrous imagery, a bit too Roman Catholic. An image of Christ in the front doorway was therefore rejected, and a compromise was suggested. It would be replaced by the figure of an ordinary Jewish bridegroom, to fit in with the wise and foolish virgins. So the virgins remained as planned, but the bridegroom was reduced to just a bridegroom, stripped of his divine and royal attributes, his halo, his crown, his orb and his sceptre, even his beard, just in case anyone would mistake him for Christ, and he was instead given a rose to hold and an uncontroversial garland for his hair. A figure of Christ was supposed to be here too, high up on the west front, but there were also objections to this, and it had to be replaced by an angel. Burgess also ran into trouble with his medieval vision for the tympanum, or panel, over the central doorway. He wanted an authentic medieval style Last Judgment, and this is his design for it here from the Book of Sculpture. We can see the dead climbing up from their coffins. You can see them on the bottom there. And you can see on the left-hand side the good being helped up to heaven by angels, and on the right-hand side then the bad being pushed down by other angels into the flames. All the humans are naked as they came into the world, stripped of their worldly garments, so that they're all equal in the sight of God. However, medieval people must have been less squeamish and less puritanical than those in 19th century Cork. Burgess's vision is mild compared to medieval ones, which often showed horrible demons doing horrible things to naked people, but it was still too graphic for the St. Finbarr's building committee. He therefore had to get rid of both the flames and the nudity, and here you can see the risen dead. You can see them on the bottom there, all coming out of their coffins, decently covered from neck to toe in flowing robes. Nudity was also seen as a problem with his design for the north doorway tympanum. Burgess had proposed an upper panel depicting the temptation of Adam and Eve. It showed their naked figures standing on either side of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, around which a serpent was entwined. Because of the objections to the nudity, however, the temptation scene was replaced by one showing Adam and Eve being expelled by an angel from the Garden of Eden, with the figures kneeling on each side of the angel, now respectably covered in dense leafy garments. So, St. Finbarr's Cathedral, as we see it today, is the result of a number of factors. The architect's romantic vision of a beautiful, truly medieval construction, modified by the requirements of an anxious 19th century Cork building committee, whose members also wanted a beautiful medieval-style church, but within limits, presumably. They were nervous about sanctioning one which looked to them both too Catholic and too immoral. They were also keen to construct a building that they could afford, and which also had the basic practical requirements of a 19th century cathedral, such as a vestry, a chapter house, and a suitable organ. So now on to the Honan Chapel in Cork. By the time you get to the years 1914 to 1917, when the Roman Catholic Honan Chapel was designed and built, there were other agendas at work. The Honan was constructed as a college chapel for the use of the Catholic students of the National University, University College Cork. This institution had been set up as non-sectarian, so a church of any denomination was not supposed to be built on its grounds. As a result, the Honan was constructed, technically at any rate, on its own grounds, and it was fenced off from the main college campus. It was financed and managed by its own separate legal trust, which was overseen by a Dublin solicitor, John O'Connell. And this was all made possible by the bequest of a local Cork woman, Isabella Honan. O'Connell was very involved with the Irish arts and crafts movement, and he thought it was very important to apply arts and crafts ideas and approaches to the building of the Honan. The arts and crafts movement was inspired by the ideas of English writers, mainly John Ruskin and William Morris. It involved a reform of art and design which focused on individual artistic creativity and the use of good local materials and craft skills. Arts and crafts people in Ireland, as elsewhere, tended to reject modern industrial methods of mass production. They saw these as the root of a lot of modern problems in both design and society, and they saw the two as connected. They felt that industrial production led to workers with no investment in what they produced, shoddy, badly made products, and therefore unhappy producers and consumers, unhappy people, leading to an unhappy society. In Ireland, one of the aims of the arts and crafts movement was to improve church art. This is because they thought it had become very bad, and also because they recognised that the Catholic Church in particular was one of the best resourced institutions in a country that was generally poor, certainly by the early 20th century. They also frequently pointed out that in other countries, the church had a long and prestigious history of art patronage. So O'Connell made sure that the artistic programme of the Honan Chapel was well thought through. Every detail was executed by artists, designers and craftspeople who really knew their stuff, and the overall design of the church was coherent and unified. We know what O'Connell was trying to do, because he put his ideas in a short book called The Honan Chapel, Cork, some notes on the building and the ideals which inspired it. And this was published in 1916 in Cork by Guy and Company. The arts and crafts movement tended, like the Gothic Revival, to look for inspiration to the Middle Ages, partly because this was a time before the development of what it saw as the scourge of industrialisation. So this is why the Honan is in the Hiberno-Romanesque architectural style, the 12th century style seen in Irish buildings such as Cormac's Chapel in Cashel. In Ireland there was the added attraction that the medieval period and the early Christian period before it were both thought of as a kind of golden age of Irish art and culture, before the country was conquered and when it was seen as a land of saints and scholars. So O'Connell brought together the work of a great selection of artists and craftspeople, such as the Dublin-based sculptor Oliver Shepherd, who made the statue of St. Finbarr over the front door. This statue also looks somewhat Romanesque in its style, as does the geometric stone decoration around it. The Honan, like Burgess's Cathedral not too far from it, was dedicated to St. Finbarr. And while the placement of a statue of St. Finbarr on the front of St. Finbarr's Cathedral was not even considered, it was seen as important on the Honan, for two main reasons. Because Catholics were generally more comfortable with images of non-biblical saints, and also because of the increased mood of nationalism and national cultural revival in the country generally by this time. Think, for instance, of the 1916 Rising happening in Dublin while the Honan was being built. Therefore, on the outside of the church you have carvings such as this one, inspired by the kind of ribbon interlace patterning seen on Irish Romanesque stonework, and in manuscripts such as the Book of Kells. This piece was designed by the Dublin-based sculptor Henry Emery, supervising a team of stone carvers from the Cork School of Art. And here you have metal strapwork, in a style which is kind of a mixture of Celtic and Art Nouveau. This was designed by the Professor of Architecture at UCD, William Scott. However, possibly the most famous work commissioned by O'Connell for the Honan was the stained glass. There are 17 stained glass windows in the church, mostly showing saints with Munster connections who lived in Ireland from the mid-5th to the mid-7th centuries. But the 11 that were designed and made by the young Dublin artist Harry Clarke have received the most attention, and deservedly so, as they are amazing works. These windows made Clarke's reputation, and he got a lot of praise, success, and other commissions because of them. Clarke was an interesting mixture as a stained glass artist. He had trained in his father's ecclesiastical art establishment, and Joshua Clarke, his father, produced stained glass and other decoration for churches all over Ireland, so his son had a good understanding of materials, craftsmanship, and very importantly, business. But Harry had also received an art education in Dublin and London, and he had travelled in Europe looking at art and glass, especially medieval stained glass, like the vivid windows still in place in Chartres Cathedral. So he also knew his art. He also read widely, and for these windows he immersed himself in the lives of Irish saints. And I think it's fair to say that he produced images of them, the likes of which had never been seen before. Here we have a detail of St. Gobnet of Ballavourney, shown in sharp profile against a non-specific background of shimmering blue and red. And she's accompanied by giant bees, and you can see here the giant bees. Bees are Gobnet's attribute, what she is known by, and she is the patron saint of beekeepers. According to legend, Gobnet once frightened a group of men who were planning to rob her convent by unleashing her hives of bees at them. and Clark included tiny images of these terrified robbers in his goblet image. So you can see them here, and there's another one here. So here we have another Clark image, St. Declan of Aardmore. And like Gobnet, his face is gaunt and serious and sort of otherworldly. He stares into middle distance, and his clothes and surroundings are dissolved into a multicoloured mass of jewel-like fragments, from which you can just make out some shapes, such as his bishop's crozier. He's accompanied by a small boy, Ruan. Here he is, and Ruan is holding a bell. You can see the bell here. The significance of this is that Clark wanted to illustrate one of the wonderful legends associated with Declan's cult. Apparently, while Declan and Ruan were living as part of a religious community in Wales, Declan owned a special bell that he had received as a gift from heaven. He gave the bell to Ruan to mind, but the boy forgot it when they sailed for Ireland. He left it behind on a rock. Declan and Ruan prayed hard to get the bell back, and sure enough, in answer to their prayers, the rock on which it had been placed, a part of Wales, detached itself from the shore and miraculously arrived, bell and all, in Ardmore in Waterford. And this, of course, is where Declan then founded his monastery. Clark just loved these kinds of stories and the weird and fascinating details they allowed him to add into his windows. This is a detail from his St. Brendan window. It's an image of Judas Iscariot, the New Testament traitor, looking grotesque and claw-limbed. And according to legend, Brendan encountered Judas on one of his many journeys. The apostle was tied to a rock in the middle of the ocean, condemned to eternal torment by demons as punishment for his sins. On another trip, Brendan came across an island called Paradise of Birds, where he heard all the birds singing Latin hymns in praise of God, as if with one voice. And Clark included tiny birds in the margin around the saint's figure. So you can see one here and one here. Now, Clark's saints don't look like other representations of saints from the period. It was not unusual to feature images of local saints in Irish churches at this time. As I mentioned already, the Celtic and cultural revivals were in full swing, but in other churches they look more three-dimensional and classically drawn and proportioned. They also tend to look gentler and sweeter, more approachable. And while they have their saintly attributes, the things associated with them so that we know who they are, these are few and simple, and there isn't the slightly obsessive fascination with them that Clark seemed to have. Saints in other churches, whether Irish or not, also tended to look rather similar to each other. There seems to be a generic saintly look. We can see this here where we have Clark's St. Gobnet from the Honan, here on the left. And beside her, another St. Gobnet from a window in St. Finbar's oratory in Goughon from around 1901. And then beside that, on the right, one from St. Coleman's Cathedral in Cove from around 1897. The Cove and Goughon windows feature Gobnet's attribute of a beehive, but they leave it at that. There is no fanciful detail or diverting narratives, so you can see the beehives here. And the saints themselves are much more naturalistically drawn than Clark's, but also classically idealised. And they also look very like each other, the generic saintly look, as I said. Now, Clark's windows are not the only unusual thing about the Honan. It's actually a fairly atypical Catholic church of the period. The altar, for instance, is a flat slab of Cork limestone on legs, with some carved geometric patterning. This was more your typical altar in Catholic churches of the time. It's in St. Coleman's Cathedral in Cove, seen here in a photograph from around 1898 from the Lawrence collection. It has lots of Italian marble and lacy Gothic spires. You might say that this is a cathedral, so of course the altar would be more elaborate, but this style of altar was seen in Catholic churches of every size all over Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It varied in size and level of decorative detail, mainly depending on budget, but it was still made of Italian marble and included lacy spires. If this was what was considered a proper altar, You can imagine how many Catholics at the time might have thought that a relatively crude and plain limestone table, like that in the Honan, was a bit odd. Also, the mosaic floor, beautiful to us now, must have seemed strange at the time, with its exotic wildlife and signs of the zodiac, signifying, of course, Christ's dominance over all creation, including the beasts of air, land and sea, and the passage of time itself. Even Clarke's St. Joseph and Our Lady, represented in windows in the chancel beside the altar, don't quite follow the conventional format for representations of the time. Joseph looks old and frail, which might fit in with biblical descriptions, but in 19th century Catholic iconography he was usually depicted as a strong, middle-aged man, appropriate for his status as a role model for fathers and working men. And Our Lady is represented in a new Irish format, Mary of the Irish, O'Connell called her, with red hair and an emerald green halo. Images of Mary in Catholic churches from the late 19th and early 20th centuries usually show her in specific, well-recognised formats. So these windows from St. Colman's Cathedral in Cove feature Our Lady of the Assumption on the left, Mary brought directly up to heaven at the end of her life, and Our Lady of the Rosary on the right. The Assumption here is related to another very popular type of image of Mary at the time, the Immaculate Conception, in which she is usually shown standing on a crescent moon, as here, for instance. These are internationally recognisable Roman Catholic images, promoting aspects of church belief or practice that were seen as important. Another popular variation was Our Lady of Lourdes, where Mary appears in a white robe with a blue sash and a yellow rose at her feet, and her hands are joined in prayer, just like the statue placed in the grotto in the town of Lourdes in France, where Bernadette saw her visions of Our Lady in 1858. None of these common images of Mary appear in the Honan, however, only Mary of the Irish. What is also missing from the Honan is this, Christ as the Sacred Heart. Again, there was probably not a Catholic church in Ireland, big or small, which did not have this image in some form, except the Honan. And as well as the Immaculate Conception, Our Lady of Lourdes and the Sacred Heart, the Honan has no devotional images and never has had, so far as I know. Devotional images are statues and pictures where people can light candles and place flowers. They are often put on altars, tables or pedestals and have kneelers and or seats in front of them where people can kneel or sit and quietly pray. These devotional images were often the most obvious feature which distinguished a Catholic from a Protestant church in late 19th and early 20th century Ireland. People must have found their absence strange at the time, but their reactions are not recorded. People were used to seeing statues and pictures like these in Catholic churches everywhere. This is a page from the pre-World War I catalogue of a large German company, Meyer & Company of Munich, whose business was selling statues and stained glass to Catholic churches all over the world. We can see a selection of Sacred Heart statues here, of the kind you'd see in churches all over Cork City. And here we have an Our Lady of Lourdes here on the left and two Immaculate Conceptions. The Lourdes statue comes in a range of heights, from 1 foot 6 inches to 6 feet, and in a range of materials, and can be bought on its own or supplied with a Bernadette figure. This kind of imagery is familiar to most of us. Even today, many statues like these are still in place. The church encouraged priests to buy them at the time because they were regulated and therefore portrayed their subject correctly in accordance with Catholic beliefs. And most priests and bishops were relieved to be able to do that. After all, you never knew what random and possibly heretical image an artist might come up with. O'Connell, of course, wanted to get away from exactly this type of image, With his arts and crafts beliefs, he would have hated the fact that they were mass-produced. He felt he had to commission artists to do individual creative work. He also believed in the new minimalist approach to good design. Less is more, unlike Burgess. He thought, therefore, that it was important not to clutter the church with too many statues and objects, and not to over-decorate. So this is how he ended up with a church that probably looked to viewers at the time as more Protestant than Catholic. This is a distinction that might not worry people now, but was seen as important then. Remember how upset the St. Finbarr's building committee had been about their cathedral looking too Catholic. The Honan therefore had no statues or pictures of familiar devotional figures, and not a lot of furniture and decoration, generally. It also had a set of stained glass windows representing Irish saints that didn't really look like saints, or at least not like what people thought saints should look like, what they were used to. Instead of holy figures that you might pray in front of, they looked instead more like the mysterious and magical fairy folk of ancient Irish legends, or Yeatsian poetry. Now, of course, we see the Honan as beautiful, but we can also still see even now that it is unusual, the product of a set of agendas that, at the time, may not have been entirely compatible with each other. Pre-Vatican II Catholicism, Irish cultural nationalism, and arts and crafts ideals. In 1953, Murphy carved this gentle-looking Madonna and Child, and the following year, a group of friends and supporters bought it and presented it to the Catholic Bishop Lucy of Cork, a man busy building what he called a rosary of churches in the suburbs of Cork City. Here is the publicity photograph of the occasion. You can see Seamus Murphy there on the left and Bishop Lucy on the right. The donors told the bishop that the statue was a gift for one of his new churches and expressed the hope that he would commission more work for Murphy. The statue was placed in the doorway of the Church of the Holy Spirit at Dennehy's Cross, but the bishop didn't commission anything else. Seamus Murphy, however, did get to work on the design and decoration of an entire church, the Church of the Annunciation, built in Blackpool in Cork in 1945. And this replaced an older Roman Catholic church on the same site, St. Nicholas's. This was financed, this one here, by William Dwyer, owner of the nearby Sunbeam Woolsey factory and employer of a significant proportion of the Blackpool population. This arrangement gave Murphy a bit more leeway than was usually the case in building and decorating Catholic churches, a bit like the situation of O'Connell in the Honan. And as with the Honan, efforts were made to employ local artists and craft workers rather than to buy mass-produced imported work. The design and decoration are minimalist and simple, less is more again, although I have to stress that seats were added later after this photo was taken. People weren't actually expected to stand. The stained glass windows were made by the Harry Clark Studios. Clark himself had died in 1931, so this was the same company he had set up, but by this stage it was being run by his wife, Margaret. Murphy himself did quite a few carvings for this church, including this one in Portland stone representing the Annunciation. It's in the tympanum over the main door. He also made life-size statues of the Madonna and Sacred Heart for the interior. And this is the Madonna carved in 1945 in Portland stone and designed to be placed on the Lady Altar. Again, this is a gentle and elegant but austere looking figure, quite unlike the usual representations of the Virgin Mary at the time. And indeed, the congregation found it difficult to warm to this different version of Mary. So much so that this is the actual statue that was placed on the Lady Altar in the church. This is the one with which people interact and in front of which they pray, while Murphy's statue is over to one side. This is another one of Murphy's Madonnas. This is in the Holy Family Church in Military Hill. It was made in the 1930s, unsold, and introduced by a priest to this church in the 1970s, and it replaced a regular statue of Our Lady of Lourdes. And one morning, about 15 years ago, I visited this church and I talked to some massgoers who had been in the church in the 70s when the statue was placed there. And what I found was that they were still resentful towards the priest for taking away the original Lourdes statue, and not at all impressed with this as an image of the Virgin. They just couldn't recognize in this the Virgin that they were familiar with. So you can see from this that founding a school of Christian sculpture in 20th century Ireland was a more complicated and difficult task than perhaps it had originally seemed to the young and idealistic Murphy. Bishops and priests had certain requirements in relation to religious imagery that were more likely to be met by off-the-shelf products, and congregations had their own needs too, familiarity and relatability being very important to them. There were some significant successes though, where the aims of the artist dovetailed really well with the needs of the audience. And I would say that Murphy's statue of St. Gubnet at her shrine in Ballyvourney is an example of this, even though the figure is modern and geometrically simplified and not at all like the conventional mass-produced statues you see at most shrines. The texture of the limestone and the sculpture's marks on it are left visible, but despite this aesthetic adventurousness, Gubnet looks human and approachable, unlike, for example, Harry Clarke's rather aloof and otherworldly figure. And indeed, it looks like visitors to the shrine have taken her to their hearts. The statue became the focal point of popular devotional practices and remains so to this day. People interact with it, they walk around it, they kneel to pray in front of it, and they hang rosary beads around the saint's neck. Murphy hated the idea of sculpture as what he called a useless ornament. So he would, I think, be pleased to see his Gubnet figure as such a meaningful part of people's lives. So to finish, William Burgess and John O'Connell in particular wanted to closely control every detail of their churches, but I wanted to highlight the different forces that go into creating the architecture and art that we see around us, the different agendas, opportunities, and restrictions, which can result in a building looking quite different and artwork communicating very different meanings to what its commissioners planned and to what the artist intended. But I think Seamus Murphy's Gubnet also highlights one very important creator of meaning in relation to any kind of artwork, and that's the viewer. No matter what great concepts the person who commissions the work has, and no matter what the artist does, the end result essentially depends on what the viewer brings to it and whether or not it resonates with them. So thank you very much for listening. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to take them, and I'll unshare now.
Thank you so much, Anne. And if Lorraine would turn back on her camera, she can thank you for the lecture.
And that was wonderful. I enjoyed that very much. I think everybody else probably did too. It's sometimes I think we take for granted the beautiful things that are around us and we walk past every day. It's just so lovely to focus in on the details and see all the wonderful pieces of sculpture and art which are there for all of us. Thank you very much indeed. Always informative, always entertaining, and thank you indeed. We'll see you again, I hope, in the near future.
Thank you, Lorraine. My pleasure.
We have lots of questions for you, Anne, and I guess the thing to do is to ask them in the order in which they were posed. Okay. So I will go for the first one. Has acid, this is from Maura Nilira, and she asks, has acid rain done much damage to the exterior of St. Finbarr's Cathedral?
It has to some parts of it, yeah. Some of the statuary, it depends on the stone that it was made from, and some of it obviously is more susceptible. It's not even necessarily just acid rain, it's also just general environmental wear and tear. Some is much more durable than others, but yeah, there is some damage. The actual stonework itself is pretty good. The limestone suits the area, but some of the statuary, yeah, definitely.
Actually, the same person, Maura, asks, are there spikes to deter birds from landing on the walls and the figures?
I think there are. I'm trying to remember. Other people might remember that. I think there are for some of them, certainly. Yeah, yeah.
People can include that on their walk and check for themselves.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A question from a great architectural historian here, Tony Harper. He says, surely there was a cloth antependium suspended from the front of the Honan Chapel altar, one that was changed according to the liturgical seasons.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, yeah. Tony is right. Yeah, yeah, there was. Yeah, yeah.
And this is a question about Burgess now. Wasn't the cost of the one of the major reasons why very few of Burgess's commissions were fully completed? Very few of his patrons had the financial resources of the Marquess of Bute, for whom he designed Castle Cosh and the remodelling of Cardiff Castle. Of
course, yeah, yeah. He was so pernickety, I think. He didn't compromise. Now, having said that, I mean, I looked, you know, I did quite a bit of work on St. Finbarr's, but I also did quite a bit of work, as I say, on Cove Cathedral. And in Cove Cathedral, the bishop really called the shots rather than the architect. And the costs rocketed there as well. I think they just tended to do that, especially with cathedrals, once they kind of got carried away at all and they decided, you know, this has to look really impressive. But Burgess was very particular that everything would be done as he wanted it. And he didn't believe, you know, if this was the best carver or the best stained glass artist, he wanted them, you know, so he was very particular. So yeah, I think costs were a problem with a lot of his work, yeah. But at the same time, anything I've seen by him that he did, they're really jewels, like they're really beautiful, you know, so.
They're kind of total artworks, aren't they?
Yeah,
sort of
they are,
thing.
totally, yeah.
Now, Catherine Campbell has said, thank you for a wonderfully inspiring lecture. A question, rather than Irish legend, might the inspiration for the depiction of Judas have been inspired by the Greek myth of Prometheus?
Possibly, yeah, possibly. Yeah. I mean, we don't actually know. I know Nicola Gordon-Bow did an awful lot of work on where Clark might have got his inspiration from. And it could have been from both. But I think an awful lot of his inspiration for most of the windows does come from Irish legends, because they are very rich, the lives of the saints, in fascinating detail. I mean, the saints seem to have had, you know, the kind of lives they led are not really the kinds of lives you normally would associate saints leading. They were very adventurous, and they were nearly more godlike than saint-like. So I think a lot of it was from them, but there's no doubt other influences as well. Yeah, he was very widely read. Yeah.
Actually, somebody else has asked, was Clark aware of Klimt and other artists who celebrated pattern?
I would imagine he was. Again, I don't know. And again, as I say, Nikki did a lot of work in that area. You know, he would have been a bit later than them. So I would have been surprised in somebody who knew so much about art that he wouldn't have been aware of Klimt and others, and Beardsley and other people like that, you know.
And Paul Donnelly asks, thanks, Anne. Did Seamus Murphy do much work for patrons in the United States?
He did do quite a few commissions, yeah. He did one famously, St. Bridget's Church, San Francisco. He did a few, yeah. You know, I mean, the commissions were big commissions. He did find it hard, though, to get work. He probably did more in the United States, nearly in that area, than he would have done in Ireland. But yeah, he did quite a few, yeah.
They're jumping between all the artists here, but there was just one dropped into the chat. Who may have influenced Clark's aesthetic?
Who may have influenced who? Clark's?
Harry Clark's aesthetic.
Harry Clark's aesthetic, yeah, we're back to the same thing again. I mean, his style is very much associated with, a lot of people talk about Beardsley, or they talk about Art Nouveau, or they talk about Klimt and such like, who would have all been earlier. So it's quite likely he was influenced by all those. His style is his own idiosyncratic style, though, I think, as well. And just the general move back towards a very decorative way of arranging the elements of a picture. I think you'd have to say that all of them, yeah, those sort of styles did influence him, but then he also made them into his own very distinctive style, I think.
So Tony's back again with another question, or another statement anyway. Delighted to see that Seamus Murphy had the same problems getting his work accepted by some locals, just as Ken Thompson's sculpture of St. Patrick in Westport, County Mayo. It seems that even now Irish people can find it hard to move away from traditional images of saints.
Probably, yeah. And the problem now as well is that there's less demand for them in lots of ways, because after Vatican II, the number of images of saints and such like in churches was drastically cut, and a lot of them were got rid of actually on the basis that there were too many of them. So so there's actually less demand. But I would have thought now, if there was demand more, if there was any demand, that it would be for more for want of a better word, artistic renderings rather than the mass-produced. But I may be wrong, yeah.
Martin Condon is asking, is there any record of correspondence between Seamus Murphy and Bishop Lucy?
I never, there may be some. I'm trying to think now. There could be. I don't think there's a lot, though, if there is. I did look through an awful lot of Seamus Murphy's posts, you know, the letters that he exchanged before, but I don't think there would have been much. I mean, he did a commission in Carrigaline, and I think indirectly it would have been through Bishop Lucy, but it would have been the parish priest he would have dealt with. And I know Bishop Lucy asked him, I think, this is anecdotal now, but I think it's probably true, the church in Mayfield, the new modern church in Mayfield, with there's a kind of a very minimalist statue of Our Lady on the top, and I don't know, did he ask him to put a head on it or something? And Seamus Murphy wasn't too impressed anyway. A bit offended, I think, as far as I can remember. Yeah, like he wasn't, you know, Bishop Lucy wasn't really into that kind of thing, like, you know, really.
So Eva Jane asks, were these artists self-taught, or did they have formal training in their craft? So that really in the lecture.
Yeah. They both had Clark and like Burgess would have had training as an architect, and then Clark and Murphy both had formal training as artists, as well as practical, apprenticeship type training too. So they had everything really.
The questions are coming in thick and fast down here. This is so Tony again. The facade of the Honan Chapel is based on the facade of St Cronan's 12th century church in Musgrave, and the interior is inspired by Cormac's Chapel in Cashel. But do we know which church inspired the chancel art of the Honan Chapel?
I don't particularly know. No, and I don't know if O'Connell said it, so you can only speculate, really. Like, you know, I to be honest, I don't know. Sorry, Tony.
Yeah, they're one of the better surviving features, actually, of Romanesque churches. So, Tony, that's a study for you to undertake now. We'll be looking forward to hearing a lecture on that very soon. Where is Murphy's correspondence kept today, says Tony?
I don't know, but the last time I saw it, it was in his son's house.
Okay. And Paul Donnelly again. Who was the congregation of the Honan Chapel? I imagine Clark's work would have caused quite a stir in a normal parish church.
Yeah, it would have. I think it was supposed to be for students of the university students, men, guys, because the Honan Hostel was for young men attending the university. So for them, and I presume, you know, I mean, it doesn't hold very many people, so maybe some staff members or whatever, but yeah, so it would have been for a very specific group. And I think you're right. I think it would have not, you know, I think it would have been very strange in a normal parish setup. I don't think it would have ever got through a normal parish building process, and I don't think it would have been very well accepted once it was built in a normal parish setup.
That's fantastic, thank you. We just have one of our own members of staff, Jerry Gabriel, asked that he just wants to know who made the stained glass windows for St Finbar's. Were they all by the same company?
They're all by Saunders. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they are. Certainly the vast majority are Saunders anyway. Yeah. I think they all are. Yeah.
We're also getting some thanks for the lecture, which I think everybody has really enjoyed. Will I do one last call for questions from anybody? Thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear about the kind of the context of the creation of an artwork, the intention of the architect, the reception by the patron and the public. There's a really interesting article by a man called Michael T. Davis, and he's actually talking about the study of medieval buildings, and he says he talks about that it's so dominated by people in anoraks looking for masonry breaks, when actually there's so little about how people actually used them or thought about them, or
Yeah.
Actually, this, studying the reception of 19th century and early 20th century architecture, I'm sure it was probably the same in the Middle Ages. If somebody changed style, they'd be like, "That's not the Virgin I'm used to." Could you? I can't worship here.
Yeah, no, I would definitely say so. I mean, I think a lot of the time buildings and artworks are talked about as if they sort of float free of a kind of a social context or a cultural context or whatever. And there's so many different things, and there's so many reasons why they turn out the way they are and how people react to them and everything. They're embedded in our society, and I think that can be nearly the most interesting part of it sometimes,
Absolutely.
apart from the fact that they are beautiful anyway. But it is interesting to see why they are the way they are, I think,
I'm just waiting to see if there are any more questions. We'll give people one more minute to type furiously. I thought it was quite interesting that Burgess, almost felt he lived in the 13th century and was so just, so obsessed by these buildings, But in a way, there are so few of the churches that he was obsessed by that were total artworks. They took so long to build that there were changes of style. That west front of Chartres with so many different ages.
Yeah, there are two beautiful ones in Yorkshire that he designed and completed. They're really, really nice little churches. I'm trying to remember the names of them now off the top of my head. I need to look up my notes, but they're lovely churches actually. And he did seem to get a fair bit. They must have been well financed. I think they're just parish churches, but they must have been well financed, And of course, Cardiff Castle is pretty spectacular and completely daft.
Yeah, I actually visited Cardiff Castle and thought it's very nice for an hour, but I don't know if I could spend all of my time here with tiny cheeky monkeys looking at me from the
I don't think I fancy it either. No. Now, you'd never be bored. There's all this stuff. I'm sure you'd be sitting there looking at it, trying to figure out what exactly was he trying to communicate here. But it is fascinating. Yeah, I mean, he just, he just was obsessed with it, and he just loved the medieval period.
Well, on that note, I think we've answered everybody's questions. So I know that Lorraine has already thanked you, but from Nanonego Place, it was great to host you. Thank you for being here, and thank you to everybody who attended on this lovely sunny Saturday morning. It's a testament to the subject and the great speaker that over 60 people were with us this morning to listen to the lecture. So thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
And Tom says thanks a million, Anne. So see you all soon for another lecture.